Town. Let's talk about small business now. We talk a lot about big companies. We talk about Transnet spending hundreds of millions, even billions of rand and creating a lot of jobs. But it is conventional wisdom, I think, that small and medium-sized businesses are the ones that create the real jobs. So as I say, let's talk about small business and small business optimism with a company that is a small business, but it's also listed on the JSE Securities Exchange. In the Cape Town studio with me is Chris van der Merwe, CEO of Curro Holdings. Chris, thanks very much for joining us today. Small business, you are a small business, you're on the JSE, but you obviously have ambitions to go further. You've obviously got ambitions to employ more people. What was the environment like when you first came up with the idea of going into business? Was it easy to do business?
Lindsay, not at all. I think in our trade, I'm referring to the private school trade, the government scratched out Model C schools, so that created an opportunity. But still it was very, very difficult because you had to create your brand, you had to make parents stroke clients aware of your product, and obviously you had to start very small.
But never mind the actual specifics of your business. Your business is education, of course, and we'll talk about that later. What about the barriers to entry, the administration, the banks lending you money, all that sort of thing? Was it easy to actually take your idea and implement it?
Lindsay, very tough indeed. I think the 3 years in the world of any entrepreneur is very, very challenging. For instance, our first bank loan, just to convince the banker to loan that first 7 million. Obviously today we've got a market cap of about 4 billion, but in those first 3 years it was extremely difficult to start up a business.
So when we talk about the National Credit Act, that was a good thing that was brought in order to protect consumers, but on the other hand it's sort of made banks withdraw into their shell and not lend to businesses like yours. People must become despondent. I mean, there must have been a point where you said, actually, you know what, I'm just going to go and get a normal 9-to-5 job.
Yes, indeed. But, I think if we were to do something great for South Africa, I think we've got to support our entrepreneurs because it's there where job creation will, appear in the offing. Currently, for instance, we have 1,500 people working for Curro Holdings. When we started the company, we were only 5, and that happened in 15 years. So Lindsay, I think bankiers must support entrepreneurs because that's the place where South Africa, as a matter of fact, the African continent will grow in the future, I believe.
And also, of course, the business that you're in, education, is almost the first step towards small business and the growth of any emerging economy like South Africa's. People have to be educated. We've been focusing on education all week on CNBC Africa, and it's become apparent that unless we get that right, then there's going to be no entrepreneurs.
We often argue about the ultimate goal of education, and obviously you've got to create a balanced citizen, but ultimately this citizen should contribute to an economic growth. So we are busy re-engineering our curriculum to make sure that the curriculum content is relevant and that children that leave at the end of grade 12 must be well qualified so that they can find a place, get a job and contribute to solid economic growth. I would say 6% in South African context. That's the aim.
Well, that's very interesting because when we spoke to a professor from Wits University earlier in the week about higher education, tertiary education, executive education, MBAs, etc., I asked him the question, are MBAs that are taught in the United States of America and also via Wits and other institutions in this country relevant for Africa? And you're doing the same thing. You're sort of changing your curriculum to suit the needs, almost like a bespoke education process.
Sure. We often say our kids, when they become semi-adults, when they leave the world of school, they've got to become something. They must become a plumber or a medical doctor or a teacher or an electrician or an engineer. But to qualify them for the sake of having a qualification, I think, it makes no sense. They've got to have a qualification and become something by means of which they can contribute to economic growth by their skill set.
How much demand is there for the sort of educational offering that you offer at Curro Holdings?
It's huge, Lindsay. It's in terms of our growth, parents are flocking to our 25 campuses in their masses. We were 5,500 children last year. We've got a very, very good chance of being anything between 16,000 and 20,000 next year. So there's a huge demand for private education.
On the one hand, I'd say that's absolutely fantastic and well done, and you're doing a good job. But on the other hand, it's almost symptomatic of the fact that the state schooling system is in certain areas failing the youth of South Africa.
That's a very interesting argument. That's the one argument. The other argument is that we are not building enough schools. For instance, in the Midrand, there's so many kids, but there's just not enough schools. So this can also be seen as a positive, because the private sector, in terms of private school education, is complementing the state, because the moment the state defaults in terms of the ability to construct enough schools, the private sector can complement. So there's actually a very good relationship between state and private school education currently.
Does your institution prepare people who don't want to go and do the 9 to 5 or the 8 till 4? Do you prepare them for becoming an entrepreneur? We want to talk about small businesses, and we need to create more small businesses in South Africa. But are people actually given the right guidelines in order to say, you know, I don't want to work for a corporation, I'd rather do it on my own, but I just don't know how to do it? Surely that's a role that you should play as well.
Lindsay, that's such a good argument. On the one side, we've got the curriculum content of the different subjects. On the other side, one has to develop the child to understand that you've got to work hard, but you've got to work intelligently, and that takes some offerings, you know. You've got to hang in there and you've got to do your bit. Now, we have a subject in the South African curriculum called life orientation, and luckily, teachers are allowed to engineer their own curriculum content to a certain extent. So in terms of, let's just call it job ethics, you know, the ability to work hard, the ability to push through in difficult times. Those are skills that's not incorporated in particular subjects, but you've got to make sure when your child leaves the school that they are fully complemented with such skills.